Good afternoon, world, and welcome to this version of Adversarial Emulation on Wild West Hackcast. You've got me, Bryson Bort, with my co-host, Jorge Orchilles.
Hello, everyone. Welcome. Excited to be here. We have a fun hour planned for everyone.
We're going to go for an hour?
I think so.
We have that much content this time. Not only do we have a whole discussion on adversarial emulation and how to change it from a win-centric, ego-driven perspective to business-centric and results, but we have the first world release of an all-new tool framework that we'll be demonstrating later.
That's right.
If you're not following along, tune in to Black Hill's Discord. Inside there, we will be having an on-running chat. We will be doing our best to try to pick up questions as we're going. Some other folks that are going to be helping us along the way are Ryan O'Grady, who's going to get a whole bunch of credit later for all the awesome things he's helped to make this happen, as well as Jason Blanchard, who is our Black Hills Information Systems support to make this happen. Me, I'm the unicorn guy. I've done some stuff. I get around. I am the founder and current CEO of Scythe. I am the co-founder of the ICS Village, which is a nonprofit. You probably have seen us at DEF CON or some of the other conferences working on critical infrastructure. I founded GRIM 7.5 years ago, and then I am a senior fellow at the R Street Institute for Cybersecurity and National Security.
Sweet. And I am Jorge Orchilles. Been doing offensive at a global financial for about 10 years now, actually 10 years right at the end of May. I'm a SANS instructor and just released on demand and self-study a 2-day Red Team exercise and adversary emulation course, about 50% hands-on lab, and just very excited because today's actually that release day, so that worked out. Just got into NSI as a fellow starting this year, so looking forward to that. Done a few things out in industry, such as the common vulnerability scoring system that most of you use to risk or score your vulnerabilities. So version 3.1 was recently released. I'm a working group and voting member there. Created a framework for conducting adversary emulations and red team exercises with my peers through the Global Financial Markets Association. So that's a public framework for doing what we're going to talk about today. In my past life, I wrote a book on Windows 7, an operating system none of you should be running because it's end of life. And do a few things with the community, particularly ISSA. Been a member of the South Florida ISSA. Shout out to someone that said they're from Miami. Hope you come to our meetings. And also part of the webinar committee there. Looking forward to talking with y'all.
So, the value of post-exploitation. The key thing I wanted to kind of bring up in the conversation here, besides the fact that I love humor, sometimes it's even better when humor supports content, is the value of post-exploitation is you really get the contextual business risk, right? Once I'm in, once I've gained access, now I have the opportunity to be on the inside. And when I'm on the inside, my goal is to look like one of your users. I need to look like a process. I need to look like a user because that's where I'm going to be pivoting from where did I start to where do I want to go and what's of interest. And of course, there's lots of different kinds of users that we have in our environment. So the obligatory debate and semantics definition on what things are. Penetration test versus adversarial emulation.
On this one, there's many debates out there about how people get to adversary emulations from pen testing and if there's even a difference. Up here, there's a little flow diagram that I created with my awesome Microsoft Word skills and PowerPoint. And this is just how we ended up maturing. Other organizations did it differently. But most of the time, you start doing some sort of vulnerability scanning, right? Running some sort of tool that's automated, signature-based. You point at an IP address or a web app, and it comes back with this, humongous list of issues you need to fix, all with some default risk rating. And giving that to someone such as a system owner is kind of painful for everyone. So then we started doing vulnerability assessment where we were actually triaging this, validating that those vulnerabilities exist, and then giving them the appropriate risk rating. That way you give a smaller report that's more actionable. And that then led to penetration testing. And the main difference between vulnerability scanning and assessment, penetration testing, is that you're exploiting the particular system. In this case, we're always testing technology. little by little, pen testing kind of got held down based on scope and rules of engagement. PCI DSS is a perfect example of where they took our beloved pen test that could have been full scope and said, only attack this little part of the network and get a checkbox. So through that, and also understanding how adversaries are working, we pivoted to red teaming, where we test people, process, and technology. And that is where the whole adversary emulation starts coming in. And that in our organization led to purple teaming. And the first way we did that was with an in-person purple team exercise, really to get the soft skills going between the red and the blue. And yes, purple is what happens when you combine red and blue. And then get to a point where you do some continuous purple teaming. As I mentioned, pen testing, very exploit oriented, actually getting access to the particular system, exploiting the vulnerability. That was the original differentiator from the traditional vulnerability scanning, vulnerability assessment that got us here. And then from there, we wanted to actually show the business risk, right? Writing in a report and showing a senior manager that you popped a shell means absolutely nothing to them. They will literally say, is this what I paid for? To see a screenshot of you having a shell, that doesn't have this business risk. It goes back to the whole win-centric. Sure, you got in. So what? Where are you providing value? And then, we kind of got obsessed with obtaining domain admin rights, being the God mode or king of the hill or whatever you want to call it, right? So we kind of started doing that. And then all these engagements were really bound, right? They were bound by mostly money and time. So most of our pen test engagements, even today, go between 1 and 3 weeks, maybe 4 weeks. And malicious actors that are targeting your organization probably have a little more time and a little bit more budget. So that's kind of where the red team started coming in, and the whole concept of an internal red team versus an external red team. And the answer is both. Right? I mentioned I work at a large organization, but that doesn't mean that we're the only ones testing ourselves. We actually use external teams as well. And you'll even hear, I think John Strand said it recently, that the reason they partner with other pen test firms and red team firms is because it's good to get a new view of your organization. So while the internal teams have that white box approach that we were talking a little bit and has been talked about on the industry Twitter in the last couple of days, you also have a lot more knowledge, right? Like, that you run a particular endpoint protection system and that you run a particular EDR, while the external red teamer coming in from a black box perspective might not know that, might have to spend more time doing the reconnaissance phase and learning more.
A lot of people kind of roll their eyes when you get into the semantics and definition discussion, but there's several levels why this is important. The penetration testing versus red teaming question, certainly in the expert side, a lot of people kind of like, look, why have we not figured this out? Why are we still asking this question? And the reason that we do is, one, there are a lot of clients who still don't know or don't understand. They asked for a penetration test and they really meant a red team, or the level of penetration test that they were asking was more compliance driven or more of just a cheap scan. And there's lots of reasons for that. So it's not that those things are necessarily bad, but they create confusion. And so one of the other areas that there's confusion is the definitions of emulation versus simulation. And so one of the things that I like to do is, through social media, we have access to a lot of experts in the community at different levels. And so I kind of put the question out a while ago about, emulation versus simulation. And Tim Malcolm-Vetter, who runs an enterprise red team at one of the largest companies in the world, he specifically notes emulation as a specific reproduction, whereas simulation is the imitation of that. And then he came up with yet another concept called the false flag. And false flag comes from intelligence operations, where I want to look like I'm something else. So we've seen examples of this in security where, the Russians will get their hands on Iranian malware and repurpose that malware so it looks like it's an Iranian unit that did it, but meanwhile it's the Russians. And there's all sorts of different levels to do that, from the code itself to, we've seen infrastructure owned and repurposed for those kinds of things. And his point being is kind of sidestepping the question to, if we're a false flag, he's more talking about it like a red team perspective. And so he's using the false flag definition as an example of what a red team is doing, because a red team, of course, is trying to be like an adversary and look like it. On the other hand, Katie Nichols, now at Red Canary, talks about emulation is sort of in the spirit of, but can never match adversaries directly, whereas simulation implies an exact match. So we now have two leading experts going different direction. And then to throw further confusion into it, I also want to highlight, the slides will be available afterward, but you'll notice down in the lower right corner, we will have lots of sources and references because, of course, we're trying to put a lot of information into a short period of time. And we want you to have the ability to take some of these concepts and go even further. So if you ever want to get even more on any particular topic, just pay attention to the bottom of the slides, and we'll have additional resources for you to continue learning and education. And yet more simulation. So we also have some industry confusion because Gartner and Forrester have also created definitions because of the breach and attack simulation space with what they describe as attack simulation. In short, my perspective on it, and we have, of course, as you've just noted here, not an industry agreed definition yet. I think it's important to note that, one, when we're talking about attack, we are trying to replicate it at a level that is business-centric, which means if I'm just going to be focused on looking at controls validation, then a simple checklist approach might work. Whereas if I'm trying to look at something that is more sophisticated and is true emulation, where I want to be this thing, this adversary, and try to see what's that full risk on my environment, that's not going to work, and I need to be able to chain scenarios together much like an actual adversary works. So some key elements to being able to do emulation. We need a tool that is flexible and repeatable, and we need that for multiple reasons. The flexibility, it's key that this is customizable. If I'm going to be emulating an adversary, the level of that emulation, whether that's at the level that the code, the actual payload, or the behaviors or TTPs need to look different every time, requires the tool to be technically flexible. The repeatable component comes in as we start looking beyond, hey, I'm just a red team doing something, to the fact that I am trying to go more toward a purple with involvement with the blue. And the more that something is repeatable, where I, as the red team, have crafted this emulation, this capability, now I can easily share that with blue to be able to use that and to validate the remediations, or the ability to run something repeatedly so I can start to gain metrics, right? I get a baseline of performance, and if I'm able to repeatedly test that over time, I can see where things change, I can see where things improve, and I can have a realistic understanding of what our posture is. The other part is we're trying to look for kill chain insight. And what I mean by this is not necessarily Lockheed's kill chain, but the concept of an attacker moving in stages through what they're trying to accomplish, and understanding what are our defensive choke points. Where are there particular people, process, or technology that's able to prevent stopping that at that particular point. And then finally, the automatable component is that ability to allow the repeatable to work at scale. Anything you want to add back in, George?
No, that's actually all good. And got a question here. Why do these definitions matter?
Yeah, so when you jumped off, one of the reasons I did answering that was that there is a lot of confusion in industry and with customers around what something means. And to a certain degree, as long as we can explain it on a case-by-case basis, it works. But wouldn't it be easier if we all had a common understanding of what we mean? And this is the reason that a lot of these discussions still get rehashed, and why we're sort of at the forefront of defining what is emulation, simulation, and purple teaming, because this is sort of the latest growth of that discipline.
Yep, and all good answers. And just to add to another reason is that the regulators have definitions as well, and you have to meet those regulatory requirements. So when they ask for a pen test and you realize that they don't really want a pen test, that they need something else, then it kind of is bad for the industry as a whole. So back to you.
Can you share the pre-chat example you were talking about with insider threat for that?
Yep. So that's an interesting one. That's one that we're getting asked about right now, about what are you doing for insider threat? And one of the things we do is we do assume breach penetration tests, where we get a system in a particular country and we use that system in a brand new account to see what we can do. The scope is the entire country. We can do pretty much anything possible there. And while that, some regulators say, okay, that covers your testing for insider threats, others don't agree with that and want more. So it's definitely something we're seeing quite a bit of more now from various regulators, given that insider threat is a high-risk item, especially for a number of different organizations, depending on your threat model.
And thank you, Alice, for commenting on the request for offering to the demo gods. They are angry. Considering we're going to be giving a more in-depth demo later, we do need some sacrifices to make sure that everything goes smoothly. So, of course, this leads to the next contention, white box versus black box. So white box is typically thought of as using the insider knowledge of an organization, where black box is the external actor focus. And so I ran a poll yesterday on Twitter asking for what is your preference. And part of what I'd like to point out is it's not that white box has to be necessarily insider versus external actor, is so much as it's the level of information that you want to do. Going back to the previous example where we were talking about finding and identifying the kill chain choke points, that's also part of where a white box solution can get us there, right? Maybe I don't need you to emulate an adversary. You're not going to go and hire actual spies to go and break into a building or, try to follow people around to gain information. Whereas I'm going to shortcut that entire piece by giving you some level of information to push you down the spectrum where we're focused more on the results from a business perspective that we're looking for. So we got some great answers back from folks on what is your preference. So the first, Sunil Yu, and he says, well, a pen test evaluates protective preventative controls. That should be black box. Red teams should primarily be testing response controls. That should be white box. Followed by Aaron Gratifiore. Pen tests should always be white box or you're wasting money and or time. And red teams should be mostly black box. That's also not the best way to think about it. They should be realistic above all else. And then finally, Tim Malcolmbetter jumps in with, it's a false dichotomy. Neither has to be exclusively open or closed. In general, every extreme answer is too rigid and therefore wrong. And I really like Tim's because if we think about white to black box as a spectrum of information, going back to what's the original purpose of the discussion here is defense is informed by the threat. I don't know what works until I'm able to test that something can circumvent it. I mean, going back all the way back to our CISSP days, right? Confidentiality, integrity, and availability. These are the security pillars that I'm measuring my business operations against. And what we're trying to do with emulation is replicate the threat that might be able to affect it across those different pillars. And so the white box, the black box spectrum depends on what is your business goal and what is your focus. They are not necessarily mutually exclusive, and they are something that you can shift from operation to operation, again, focusing on what are we trying to accomplish so that the business gets what it needs.
Yeah, exactly that. The business goals top all other goals, regardless of what your red team wants to do. Really, the business goals are what matters, and at the end, you're going to do all of these, right? It depends on your threat model, but we definitely in a large financial are doing all of the above. So, smaller orgs that have to choose between one and the other will make their choice. But definitely a good debate going on there.
Yeah, so Daniel asked the question, could you contrast black versus white in regards to value return to the customer? And just to emphasize, in case the question came out before or after what I just said, is it really is specific to what that customer goal is. There are customers who are going to be very interested in surface area analysis, which is going to be a bit more of a black box perspective, right? Like maybe at most, I'm just going to point you to my domain. Maybe I give you the IP addresses, so you're just focused on those IP addresses. Maybe I'm going to give you the computer names. maybe I'm going to give you further, and I want you to already have enumerated what are the security controls that are in place in those areas, because those are all levels down the step, walking from outside to in, that an attacker will either already know or eventually figure out. And the question is, from a customer perspective, what gets you what you're looking for? On average, my perspective, if you wanted like a simple answer, I think a full white box solution is the closest you're going to get to emulation outside of right out of the box, because at the end of the day, any determined sophisticated actor will eventually get all of the information that you're looking for. Some things that might be more interesting though, like for example, as a sophisticated adversary, one of the first things I do when I land is I'm going to conduct my own local enumeration of your box. I need to understand what are the host defenses that I need to avoid or defeat before I do anything else, and I could potentially make a mistake doing that. So that might be something you're interested in trying to see, but for the most part, they're already going to have that figured out. Any really good adversary, if you're trying to emulate one of the big ones, all of your host defensive controls are a part of the test matrix for the offensive products that they're launching. Defense validation. So I'll throw this back to George because I've been talking for a while.
This is an interesting one, right? Where we talk about things like control validation, and we'll do a test, and particularly in large, complex environments, right? We'll run a test, and something might work today, and then we go do the test tomorrow, and something stopped working, and you have actually no way of knowing that unless you're actively testing, right? So from the red team side, we want to be emulating behavior. Are you emulating this all the time? Can you get to a point where you are just continuously testing various TTPs? You can get close, right? And it depends on organizations, right? And their maturity level. But are you going to be doing control validation through your red team? And the answer, for the sake of your red teamers, is no. You don't want your red team doing the testing just for control validation. There are other methods that you can employ to automate most of that does not involve the red team at all. One of the times where we, as an example, when we went through this, is we wanted to make sure a particular Windows log was triggering and showing all the way on the blue team's dashboard, right? And as a red team, that involves a lot, and I might not actually know all that. So you need first your Windows system to be logging that particular thing to catch it. Then once it is logged, you need to send it somewhere to a log aggregator. You can do that through multiple ways, right? There's Windows event forwarding, there's Splunk agents, or all the, all the various different ways you can send log. Then you need some sort of analytics that are occurring there that will trigger and show this particular alert to your security operations center, whether it's a SIM or whatever product they're using. To do that, there's a lot of complexities there. And if something breaks, how do you know it breaks? And do you really want your red team going in and having to test this over and over and over when they could probably automate it, right?
And so the executive perspective is, okay, the budgets in an organization with respect to this discipline are as follows, and these are inviolable. They never change. The largest budget in any organization is always the budget to run the business. If I am a factory that makes cookies, then most of my money goes to making cookies. Being a modern business in today, particularly in today's quarantined environment, depends on technology. And so a fraction of that budget is going to be for information technology, which is what allows a modern business to scale. A fraction of that budget is going to be for IT security, securing the IT to support the business. And then below that is niche security, right? Things like red teaming and offense are actually a fraction of IT security. Most of the security investment is going to be in defending it. Less is going to be in testing it. As an executive, I'm spending this money on people and on technology to secure that investment. What is my ability to validate that investment? How do I test that? How do I find that I'm getting value versus snake oil? 20 to 25% of all security products purchased are left on the shelf because I can't even figure out how I use them after I bought them or how to optimally use them. An even greater percentage of those that have been installed are just installed with the default configurations. So they're not even bringing me the defensive merits that I bought them for. And so being able to understand that, dial it in for my environment, being able to validate those investments, if I'm outsourcing to a SOC or an MSSP, my ability to go, hey, am I actually getting my money's worth? There are tens of thousands of businesses in the world. They're the medium-sized company that has gone to the managed service security provider because they have a few IT people, and they're like, hey, I need you to protect me. And I don't have the time, I don't have the resources to do it myself. How do I know what I'm getting from you? Because at the end of the day, I cut a check, and I only know something's wrong when you tell me something's wrong, when you finally have found that something is wrong.
Yep, and that's spot on with what someone just mentioned here. Is a lot of the time the people using the tool don't even understand what they're looking at, even at the MSSPs.
Yeah, and so that leads into threat intelligence. So we've all seen the hype model. New concept, new technology comes out, and everybody is just blown away. Oh my gosh, this is the greatest thing since sliced bread. And if you think I'm kidding, why do you think we're still talking about blockchain? Challenge with threat intelligence is it went from all of this promise and all of this hype to where we are today, and it is part of the status quo. And the status quo is, okay, I will give you automated indicators of compromise. But the challenge there is, what are those indicators of compromise, and what level do I get those indicators of compromise? And it's really easy, to quote David Bianco's Pyramid of Pain, to give you hashes, to give you domains, to give you IPs, things that are relatively easy for me to go, okay, that actor is tied to that thing, and I'm going to give that to you. The problem is, how easy is it for the attacker to change it? And with it constantly changing, we are left in a position of industry of being really good at understanding what happened yesterday and getting surprised tomorrow, because threat intelligence has yet to give us a way to get ahead of that. But there is an area where they give us that level of detail, and that's the analyst reports. The problem is you have to read them, and they're 40 to 60 pages. And as you're going through and as you're reading all of this great information, it's like, okay, I now understand that's what happened. I'm not just focused on static IOCs here. I can see behaviors. I can see where this might go. I can see how I can tweak this. But how do I bring and ingest that into my environment to be able to operationalize it? How's threat intelligence treating you, George?
We need it, right? And if you're going to emulate an adversary, then you need to understand how they function, which is a great lead up to this next slide here about actually taking threat intelligence from anywhere, really. If you are a blue teamer, you're generally looking for indicators of compromise. If you are a red teamer, then you're trying to actually pick out the tactics, techniques, and procedures. So this graphic originally came from an idea from Katie Nichols, and the one I use in my course to kind of show the differences of threat intelligence. And this is a real report from FireEye, I believe. And as you read just the first sentence, there's three areas there, three different types of threat intelligence. There's auto IT, which is a software. There's PowerShell, which is a technique. And then there's an IP address, which is an indicator of compromise, but not something that you will actually use to emulate, right, as a red teamer. So we do need to understand this threat intelligence, and we have to sit there and read it and understand it and put it together into an adversary emulation plan. I think to be a good red teamer, you definitely have to understand the threat intelligence.
So here's an in-depth example that recently came out from Microsoft of the Astaroth campaign. And what I like about this is we're taking it even further with visuals as we understand the attack chain, as we're tying it in, and we can break down this campaign into very high-level understanding of, all right, how did I get access? Well, I started by spear phishing with a URL. That URL gives us our initial stage loader, which is a batch file that calls back to a JavaScript. Then that JavaScript, through 3 different stages, downloads components that compiles itself into an executable through a combination of DLL hijacking and process injection. So a lot of complexity in stage 2 to finally build myself up into my full payload. And I like this part because it highlights one thing that I see as a real gap in a lot of the emulation that is attempted out in industry, is thinking that my ability to have a monolithic code base that can do lots of different things means I am fully emulating something. And here we see a real-world example that was just uncovered 2 weeks ago where, and we already know this, the adversary does not show up in their initial access vector for the most part with everything. I have a better chance of landing in that initial access if I'm dropping very innocuous, simple code. One, nothing's going to catch it because it doesn't do very much. And two, if you do catch it, or if I'm somewhere that I don't want to be, like maybe a forensic sandbox, then you haven't caught my crown jewels. You haven't caught the fun tools and capabilities that I want to bring in to be able to accomplish my goals. And so we see a very complex multi-stage 2 buildup here to then be able to launch the full campaign capabilities, where then I focus on, of course, host enumeration. Where am I? What do I have to contend with? What's around me? To then, of course, stealing credentials, because stealing credentials is what ultimately is going to lead me to the appropriate data exfiltration of contextual business risk. Using attack to attack Mitre attack by attack. So if you have not heard of Mitre's attack framework by now, what rock are you living under? Now that you've definitely heard about it because you're on this broadcast, Mitre's attack framework is the most accomplished compendium of understanding all of the different stages and the level of those stages of what is done across an attack. The value to us, going back to the question earlier, why do definitions matter, is we now have a common periodic table to describe what we see in adversarial behavior. This is great because now I can put things together in an order to explain, and we all have a common template for understanding, as well as we now have a common framework for being able to map this out ourselves to emulate adversaries. So the good things about attack are we get this common language. I coined the term periodic table last year because I thought this was really important to distinguish that this gives us the ability to look at components of all those little boxes in Mitre attack as different elements. And when I combine elements together, it's like a chemical equation. Describing hydrogen and oxygen by themselves doesn't mean anything. Combining hydrogen with 2 parts oxygen is now water, and that's something where those stages and that chaining of those scenarios of those elements gives us that chemical equation which thoroughly describes an attack and makes it much easier for red and blue and the executive level to discuss. Some of the downsides, of course, are whenever we show something that is really easy and is comprehensive, it's really easy to abuse it, because now we can look at that and go, all right, well, I've got that box, and I've got that box, and I've got that box. Like we talked about, the reason I like to use it, the discussion of a periodic table, is we're not looking at individual elements per se. If we're looking at an emulation perspective, we want to be looking at the iterative chain of what those elements are doing combined.
This brings us to the C2 matrix. And you heard in the pre-show band, as I was writing the 2-day red team course, I chose to go with Empire, which is one of the most common command and control frameworks, and mostly because in a classroom environment, you need something that's reliable and consistent, which Empire definitely was. As that went end of life, I started asking around, hey, what's your favorite C2 and what's your favorite C2? And I got back a whole bunch of different answers. And information about all of these wasn't ideal at the time, so started with just a basic spreadsheet, and then was talking to Bryson over lunch at DerbyCon when he did the first iteration of this talk, and he was also running Caldera and a couple other C2s just to see how easy or hard or impossible they were, and just started writing down features, and we ended up releasing this, and really it's 41 frameworks that allow some sort of command and control, and many of these are open source. There are a few that are commercial, and so we created this originally for red teamers. You have to emulate an adversary, which command and control will get you to emulate the most tactics, techniques, and procedures that adversary does with the least amount of tools and learning curve. And then as we've gone, number of different contributors, and we now have 41 different frameworks on there. So it's available on the c2matrix.com and Twitter, C2Matrix, for the latest update. let's go to the next slide, which is what we are releasing today. So big shout out to Ryan. I've worked with Ryan O'Grady for a bit now. He actually creates the SANS Slingshot, which is a community pen testing framework or virtual machine, and also the one for my 2-day course. So we started talking and said, how cool would it be to bring a virtual machine that has some of these command and controls already pre-installed? By that, we will lower the learning curve. We'll make these open source tools that are already on GitHub and being used by a number of different actors, whether they're red teams or malicious, and allow others to use it. So we are presenting and releasing this today, and I'll love to show you a demo here. I think I need to make myself presenter, show my screen. All right. So please pray for the demo gods, because as you all saw, my audio already died, right? And I see that this is a little slower. So we'll start with the c2matrix.com. This is the home where you can find all the information about the C2 matrix. At the top, you have the various different things about. You'll hear everything we just talked about. There is a questionnaire called Ask the C2 Matrix. It goes through the various different command and control frameworks and asks questions like, do you need a command and control that's multiple teams, that multiple users can log in, you know, putting the team on red team. And as you go through, it updates the available command and control. So that was on our original launch. What we're releasing today is the documentation. And then you have a GUI version of the command and control matrix. This gives you all the various things you can see. I'll let it load. There you go. So here you see various command controls on the left, the version that was reviewed. Shout out to all the contributors. If you have a new C2, let us know. We'll add it in there, even if it hasn't been evaluated yet. And then how it was implemented. You can see some are implemented with Docker, some with pip, some with binaries, etc. And as we went through all this, installing all of these was difficult. It's actually very hard to get them all working at the same time. I started with a Kali system, and then from there, I would take a snapshot, install a new C2, test it out, then revert the snapshot and do it again. And the installation isn't ideal. So one of the things we're solving with the Slingshot C2 Matrix Edition is they're already installed for you. So you can see AppFile, for instance. It's written in Python. The agents are in Python. It's multi-user, has a web UI, etc. And you can go through all this. It's a nice little GUI. The original and the golden source is this Google Sheet, right? And I understand it's not so pretty to see, but you can see the various different command and controls. You can see who evaluated them. So shout out to all our contributors, whether their licenses are commercial or open source and which ones they use, the various different versions. And then you can see the various different capabilities of each. I think we track over 40 different capabilities, and there's currently 41 command and controls on there. So what we have today for you is the documentation, and that is the how-to. So how-to.the-C2 matrix takes you to this Git book, which, as I presented this, people were just asking, which is your favorite? How did you install it? How did you run it? That is pretty much the brain dump in a more organized fashion than my standard notes. So here, the first thing you can do is click on Slingshot and see what we have. So Slingshot 2 is bringing pre-installed 9 different C2s. You see them there, Appcell, Covenant, Empire 3 with Starkiller, which is a GUI for Empire 3. Empire is fully supported now by the folks at PC Security. So even though the original developers are not supporting it, it's actually fully supported now. Faction, Coatic, Merlin, Metasploit, Silent Trinity, and Sliver. And you download it through SANS, so we are hosting this, and this will be the new virtual machine used for the 2-day Red Team course, also giving it out for everyone. Go through SANS. SANS has the SANS Slingshot, so we're using their brand, and they're hosting it up for us. You bring the file in through VMware Workstation or Fusion or whatever you use, and then the username and password are Slingshot. Why is the image so big? It's because it has all of these installed and there's a lot of dependencies. Let me show you one more thing. The C2 matrix lab. So this is what we used right there, is what we use to test. We have a pfSense firewall that has 3 different zones. One allows us internet access. The other one is for the attackers. And then the third one is for our victims. We had one of each victim, so Windows 10, a Mac, and Ubuntu being the main things that you're targeting in your emulations, and all going through pfSense. So this actually all can run from a virtual machine. You can see my pfSense here that will load up. We have 3 different networks. My C2 Slingshot is now running and connected on that network. This is what it will look like. And I have an IP address that you will see here shortly. I know there's a little bit of lag. I'm actually seeing your view. So I have an IP over here of 10.0.0.1.5. My Windows 10 victim is over here with an IP of 192.168.1.105. Now, most of these command and control frameworks are post-exploitation. So we're going to skip initial access for this demo and get straight to it. Some things I like to do before I do this is 1, fully update my Windows 10, and then 2, run Wireshark with a filter. Right now, this filter is only going to show me things for IP address 10.0.0.1.5. So if I ping that, my filter is not working. Come on, demo gods. Oh, I did have it running. Why is my filter not working? Oh, there we go. All right, so I could see the ping, the various different ping requests there. So I know that I'm seeing traffic between my attacker and my victim. Over here, I ran Sliver. Now, Sliver is one of the C2s. If you don't know how to use this, you can go and click Sliver on the how-to. And here you have how to install Sliver. You have how to run it, which is where you would start if you're using this virtual machine. We already did the install for you. So I ran it with sudo privileges, and I ran generate. Now, the reason I did this is because Sliver creates the binary for you on the fly. So I ran Sliver up here, as you can see. I believe you can see there. Yep, sudo Sliver server. And then I ran the command generate --HTTP 10.0.0.15. So I'm going to use an HTTP channel, and Sliver actually creates a binary for you then. It took here 10 minutes to create this binary, and you can see it is running and saved it in /home/slingshot, and it gives it a random name, which is always fun to see. You get some very strange names. Now I have this agent created. So what do I need to do? I need to move this agent to my temp folder. So that I can then host it. So over here, I should have Enthusiastic Mutt, which is the name it chose. And now I'm going to just run a simple HTTP server to host this up. Again, post-exploitation. On my Windows system, I will visit my site, which is 10.10.0.15, and I'm going to download this executable, which is something you should be able to do post-exploitation. Once it downloads, you click it, and it should run security products. It should run, and we should get a shell over here. Oh, actually, we won't, because I actually didn't start a listener. So you have to start your listener, and then we will run this again. And now, hopefully, we get something. There we go. New session was created. So there is a communication channel now going between these two hosts. I can go over to Wireshark and My filter is still not working for whatever reason. Okay, Wireshark is very slow right now. And I can interact with this particular session. So how do you interact? Well, we go back to our how-to and see sessions and then use a session. So we type sessions. Oh, now we have 2 sessions. And then I think it was use 1. And now I can interact with that particular one. So this is one example. This was Sliver. The other one, if I can do it real quick here, we go back here and we can try one called Merlin. Merlin's interesting because it uses HTTP2. Now, how many of you are actually monitoring HTTP2 traffic outbound? How many of you actually knew that HTTP2 is enabled in your network? Right. So if your browser, if you're using some of the latest browsers, which I'm sure you are, you probably have this enabled. So Merlin is a little different, and I'm seeing we're actually running short on time, but you can run Merlin just by copy and pasting this. You need to give it an IP address and a pre-shared key, in which case you do that by just going to /opt. And here you see everything that's installed. We're going to go into the Merlin directory and then copy and paste and run these through. So we are getting short on time. I'm not going to do it for Merlin, but pretty much this new build should lower that learning curve for you to use these tools. And these tools are out there. Actors are using it. The best thing you can do is to try these first in your own lab environment and then in your actual corporate environments and see what you can do. We've written these out for a number of these. So you have AppFell there, very quick guide. There's Covenant, there's Empire 3 with Starkiller, and really should just be copy and pasting. And of course, monitor your tools, right? I had Wireshark here running. You can have Sysmon, you can have whatever other tools you have, and all of this is free for you to obtain. So if you want that, it is fully released right now on how-to.
Are we losing you again?
And no, someone was calling me. They don't know I'm doing a webcast. So how-to.thec2matrix.com, and it's available there. So we'll go back to our presentation, which I don't even know if I have up anymore. I do. Here we go.
All right, we're on slide 29.
All right. There we go. So we are on slide 29. So what are we releasing today? The SAN Slingshot C2 Matrix Edition. Again, big shout out to Ryan. Awesome person. Reach out to him if you have questions, or he is doing a lot of consulting work lately. So if you need some cool consulting work, reach out to him. We have a feedback form as well for anything in the C2 Matrix. So the c2matrix.com has a feedback there. So whether it's a bug report, you want a new tool, you want us to evaluate something, etc., let us know. And then what we're working on is mapping what each of these command and control frameworks can do post that initial communication, right? So we got the shell on Sliver. Now what? What capabilities does it have? And map that back to Mitre attack. We actually have already done that for about 7 C2s, and we'll continue to do this as we go. If this interests you, let us know. We're open for contributors. Again, this is just community stuff that we do for fun and to lower learning curves. If malicious actors are doing, you should do it too. And then if you are a Kali Linux fan, we have been working with the folks at Offensive Security to bring some of these C2s also to Kali, if that is your favorite. But you should really use the Slingshot. So with that, we'll wrap it up. Want to cover behaviors?
Emotech,
or you want to run through it?
Nanocore, Remcos, TrickBot. Notice
they
any
all
trends?
use HTTP.
They're also old, and they still work, and they're cheap. You can buy these for $50 to $100 on the dark web. 2 levels to think about when we're thinking about emulation here: network activities and host activities. So one of the things I like to point out is that information security, it's always seemed to be a common wisdom that, oh, well, the attacker's always going to win. The attacker knows my environment better than I do. But funny enough, At the network level, they don't. The communications that they have to use 99.999% of the time, unless we're talking, fringe spy out of band stuff, they have to use your communications. There's only so many ways that computers talk, like we just uncovered, HTTP2, right? If I'm going to use HTTP2, that's something that's already in your environment organically. I have to figure out how do I blend in with what you got, which means I have to use the protocols that you have in your environment. I have to use them at the time and the behavior pattern of what your natural business is doing, because anything else is going to stick out like a sore thumb. Lateral movement, of course, is my ability to use network communication to go from host to host. Keep in mind, an adversary almost never starts where they want to. Most often, they're getting in somewhere and they need to figure out where they are and then iterate through to where they want to go. Lateral movement, of course, is how they do that. How do I pivot from point to point? I'm going to use a lot of password spraying. I'm going to try to use vulnerabilities inside. I'm going to try to use credential theft. I'm not necessarily going to be as sneaky here, because once I'm inside, there's already the presumption that I'm looking like whatever I'm doing automatically is masquerading like some person or process. And so from a defender perspective, we want to be thinking of this combination of, should these things be talking? From an architecture perspective, should these things be on the same network? Simplest implementation, which would be very relevant of everything that's been happening in the last month, of course, is the concept of a DMZ. As we have lots of workers suddenly becoming remote, having them come into a DMZ or having them put into a place of least privileges and isolated from other things is a natural defensive mechanism to solve the challenge that we're facing right now. Host activities, finally, what am I able to do on host? And I need to be able to looking at everything from, of course, ransomware has become rampant. How do I simulate destruction versus actually doing something destructive? To looking at what kinds of things is an attacker going to be doing on hosts that are of interest. We talked about credentials. Two that we didn't talk about, escalation. I don't necessarily always want to escalate, but sometimes there's a purpose to doing that. And then finally, persistence. How do I survive reboot? How do I survive patching? Understanding the different levels of I don't need to persist all the way to I need to worm into what I'm doing so that I'm surviving for a long term are different considerations. One last tool here, linked down in the corner, Mitre Attack offers the Attack Navigator. The Attack Navigator allows you to chart that course for what we're going to do. So it's really easy to use this tool to be able to put together what your emulation plan is and being able to track it over time. George, we'll close it out.
Yep. So purple team, mixing red and blue. So doing blind red team engagements and adversary emulations are high value. But you don't only have to do it that way. You can get both teams together and do it as a collaboration. So you do gain quite a bit of efficiency, particularly in creating detective and preventive controls. And there's a whole talk on this I recorded from the first SANS Purple Team Summit, available on YouTube. I'll send you a link after this. That's where these slides are from. And really goes down to making sure when you do Purple Team exercise to choose the correct DTPs. You want to choose things that will get detected, right? Because you're not testing technology at that point. You're really focusing on the people, on the process, and to train them, you can't just, throw out liver on HTTP2 when no one even knew that that was allowed in the environment and has a direct path out to the internet, right? You should choose things that should be detected, and it's mostly for training folks. Also, just real quick shout out to Miss Olson, who will be presenting at GrimCon on Tuesday and covering some of this. We've been covering and talking about some of the successes and test cases in purple teaming. So she has some cool stuff coming up there. And then, as I mentioned, this is my shout out to my class that is now available on SANS.org to take remotely. So please let me know if you take it. Let me know if you like it.